good, Brett. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right.
Good, good. Oh, you're gonna. We've been emailing back and forth furiously trying to plan this. You're gonna get a. See, the reason I liked you right away because I could just tell that you were a guy who stood up in front of people far older than yourself who have a ton of business world experience, and you have to try to teach them theology. And here's the funny thing, they might not have read a whole bunch of ancients like you, but they know something of the world. And so whatever you try to, however you try to influence or colonize them, you're going to have to get it right, because if they think it's a load of crap, they're going to tell you.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, so for people who don't know, I mean, a good chunk of my work is running a diaconate formation program. Yeah, and they're all older than me. And so I have to, I have to find a way to be an authoritative voice. And that doesn't mean being a bully. That means understanding where people's questions are coming from and answering them so that they feel heard and respected. Because if you can't do that, you'll lose them.
Yeah. And I had early on the first VBS we ran here when I got to this church. I thought, we always ran things for Vacation Bible School. We always ran things for kids. And I thought, well, let's do something for the adults, because I've taught kids all this, all kinds of stuff. So I thought, well, this was back in the Seeker days. It was like, well, let's do a marriage seminar. And what I didn't realize is that what I had were a bunch of women in their 60s and 70s, most of whom had been divorced multiple times. And here I was in my early 30s. And these women knew a thing or two about marriage, whatever I got from theology and the Bible, and they weren't going to let this 30-something, just skate over things. And when they
Right.
had been married multiple times and multiple permutations of divorce, but still in relationship with the husband. And so, the theory and the reality have to come together if you're going to convince people with some experience that you've got something to contribute.
Right. One of the places I've made mistakes that I'm trying to learn is what my friend calls the question behind the question. So sometimes someone will ask you something and you've just read a book about it. So you've got a pretty coherent answer at a theoretical level. But if you don't stop and say, why is this person asking this question? You can give a perfectly good theological answer that is a pastoral disaster.
That's exactly right.
So that's a learning curve, right? Is to figure, like it's hard to learn that without getting it wrong a few times, and then realizing, oh shoot, and then stopping to think the next time you get that kind of question, okay, what, and so you maybe turn around and ask a clarifying question back to them before you proceed to see where something's coming from, right? So
well,
there's
and
a lot of psychology involved in teaching.
Yes, there is. Well, and it's also so that's really helpful when you're in a room or even over a video thing, face to face with a person, and you're in a sense trying to meet each other somewhere. And because when you're teaching, you've got this stuff out here that you'd like to meet the individual and somehow get through the filters. And I mean, all of those filters have been developed their whole life, because we all need to filter the world, because the world is too large and too complex. So then when you're writing a book, and so I've got my little stack of books here that I refer to regularly, and I hold your book up regularly because I think what I noticed about your book right away was I think your experience of teaching and forming deacons was really instrumental in your capacity to write this book well. Because here's the thing, I mean, you've got some new insights that you're sharing, but how many pages would you actually need to, let's say, record those insights as such? And what I think what you really were able to accomplish in the book was in many ways to the credit of the work that you've done with those deacons, because they have formed you too. And go ahead.
Yeah. So most of the book was only edits that took place after I had this job for a while. So most of it was written before I did this specific work. But you're not wrong, because during my grad school, I was doing adult ed as a side gig to try to pay the bills. I wasn't a director of a formation program, but I did like weekends of teaching in other people's programs with deacons. And then I did like Tuesday night classes for Catholic teachers, many of whom are older than me, not all of them. But people who, like adult ed, right? So people who come with presuppositions and ideas and filters. Sometimes those filters are survival skills and defense mechanisms, right? And in the context of this particular book, learning to recognize, and this came from practice starting in undergrad of being a Catholic engaging with Protestants, and then watching that develop through grad school. Watching what are the defense mechanisms that initially kick in when someone hears something that's different from what they've been told to believe or taught to believe. And you can't articulate a vision for how we might come to deeper mutual understanding if you don't have a workaround for those defense mechanisms. So you have to be able to say, here's the true thing that you affirm. And I agree with you. I may not agree with how it's all worked out. At the very least, and this is what I do with Luther and Calvin in the book, is it's something like, I appreciate what they're trying to say. I think occasionally their own tools fail them, so they can't say all the way what they want to say. But I actually agree basically with what each of them is trying to say. And this is Thomas Aquinas all the way down. Thomas believes that people want to know and say true things. And that's what they're trying to do. Sometimes they fail, but they're built for truth, and they're going to keep trying to say true things. And so if you want to engage someone, what's the true thing they're at least trying to say? And if they have some success at saying it, label that. And then if you disagree with them somewhere down the line, you have common ground. And all the psychology around this stuff is pointing in the same direction as Thomas was pointing, 800 years ago. And not just Thomas. I mean, other ancient people have had this insight that you can't change people's mind by being their opponent.
Right.
You have to be their ally if you're going to get anywhere, right?
Yep.
So that's a tricky balance. And as a sort of prelude to maybe some of where we're going, social media is actually a terrible venue for being able to do that well. It's really hard to do that on Facebook or Twitter.
Yes.
Because conflict is rewarded by the algorithm. And so you're almost forced. You're at least pushed into less than productive ways of engaging with people. The psychology of it is really destructive, and it leads to a lot of anxiety, as we know, and all these kinds of things. We haven't always thought about how everything connects with even what we might talk about later, our spiritual life. What this does to our sense of internal peace and our relations with others and with God and all that kind of stuff. But this is the work, and doing it in these times is really hard. So that's kind of why I wrote you on this topic, which people watching, even though we haven't mentioned it yet, will know presumably from the title of the video.
Yeah.
Because this is the conspiracy theory thinking is now a major pastoral problem.
Yes.
Apart from being a social problem and everything else.
Right. Well, I like your mention of social media, because I think in a sense what social media has facilitated is both, I mean, a good part of, we've called it virtue signaling, but a fair amount of social media is demonstrating allyship. Okay. And you see that on Twitter all the time.
Right.
People have to, they go forward into the chaos of Twitter, and they represent that they are against racism, they are against sexism, they are against rape, you know, they are against murder. I mean, and so social media, so okay, on one hand, you've got that dynamic, which is a very important and powerful one. Inside, we want to present ourselves as truthful and good and noble and heroic. But you're right, social media also in a very low resolution way heightens the adversarial, which feeds into that. And I think, you know, so not only do we have this deep need to be seen as good, we also have this deep attraction to the contentious, to the fight. And those two things feed into each other, because we have the desire to not only be truthful, but to have truth prevail. And so there's someone on the internet who has a bad idea. I'm going to launch in and, you know, set the record straight. And social media facilitates that in a highly democratic way, where, you know, you might think that you're wrong about almost everything in the world, but if there's one thing you know about, it's this tiny little video game, and this person out there in the internet has misrepresented what this character in this little video game is about, and you're going to set the record straight. And so you sally forth to do the heroic do.
And one of the things that happens, so when I watch my Facebook feed, the particularly controversial people, when a new thing happens, right? So coronavirus happens, you get the conspiracy theories around that. For the first little while, they will get pushback from people who can see that something isn't right here. This is not like the thinking pattern. It isn't justified. This is bad thinking, right? And then eventually, after a couple weeks, people give up. And so then what happens? You post your conspiracy theory style thinking, and then what you get is, from your opponents, silence. And from your partisans, likes, loves, shares, whatever. And so it gives the illusion of victory. But what looks like victory is in fact a silo. And you've actually inoculated yourself from being challenged by people with another opinion, right? And so, like, it's very, very few people have mastered the skill of engaging on Facebook. I don't do Twitter, so my experience on Facebook in a way that allows for growth in mutual understanding and deeper appreciation of the truth by both sides. I can do that. Lots of people can do that really well over a beer with a friend. With that same friend, they can't do it on Facebook.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of dynamics built in, some of which you talked about. Another one is simply, you might get bombed, right? I'm having a conversation with you right now. No one is going to come flying in unexpected that we didn't know was listening and sort of drop a turd in the punch bowl that we have to deal with. But on Facebook, you go to bed at night thinking you're having a reasonable conversation with one person who disagrees with you. You wake up in the morning and there's 30 comments that have been spawned by someone dive bombing you. And then you got a mess to clean up. And it produces a lot of anxiety, but it also just makes it really difficult to actually get to the bottom of questions that deserve careful attention and responsible interaction, right?
Yeah. No, that's true. So let's, just want to maybe put in a plug for my friend John Vervaeke, who, I don't know how much of my channel you've seen, because people sometimes apologize to me and say, Paul, I don't watch every one of your videos. And I'll not to take anything away from the people I dearly love who do watch all of my videos, because they are out there too. And to them, I owe an eternal debt of gratitude, because they have honored me far more than I believe I am worth. But so I've had a number of conversations with John Vervaeke, who teaches at University of Toronto, and in his drive is in fact to try to help people have the kinds of conversations where, even if there are so I am a Christian. John is not a Christian. John is a non-theist. I am obviously a theist. But, you know, we have conversations where we're not going to resolve this point in the context of our 1 or 2 hours of conversation, but both of us will come away from this conversation knowing more, knowing deeper, in fact, knowing each other, and ideally, I think growing in love for one another, which to me is obviously at the heart of the Christian faith, in terms of, C.S. Lewis mentioned, the charity as of course, Lewis following many classics, charity as the cardinal virtue. And so what is a conversation for? What is an interaction for? Well, we've got beauty, truth, and love. And we're not going to, so we've got a little trinity in there too. But the conversation certainly is for truth. And it is a thing of beauty when the conversation is beautiful. But it is also to grow in love towards one another, and to practice that love, and to have that love not only begin in the conversation, but ripple out and allow others who perhaps watch the conversation and will participate in the conversation in the comment section, or in another video alongside, or in the Facebook comments, that love in fact continues to grow. And interestingly enough, with it also truth and beauty as well. So
right. Well, this gives me a little insight. I mean, so I was shocked when we first got together that the interview would be 2 hours, and some people would say it was too short, right? And I'm trying to and I watch bits of your videos when I can, but as I said in email, I got 7 kids. I can't there's no time, and
Absolutely.
I got a day job where I can set aside 2 hours to watch a video. But what just occurred to me as you were talking, to explain partly the popularity of this format, the 2 to 3 hour interview, is maybe it's a bit of an antidote to the Twitter and Facebook wars, right? So here you can actually trust that the conversation is going to go in a direction where the two sort of protagonists can be heard and engage deeply, whereas Facebook and Twitter are so fragmented that it's distracting to follow, right? Okay, the conversation was going here, but so-and-so jumped in and dropped this on it, and now it's over here, and the original point was lost, and we don't know where we're going, and it's almost like an intellectual retreat from that very fragmented space where dialogue is very difficult, into okay, here I can be safe for 2 hours and intellectually engage without worry of these kinds of flameouts, that really do produce a lot of anxiety. Actually, I mean, I admit freely, when I'm in a Facebook war, I don't sleep well. I can't focus when my kids are asking me questions, right? Because I'm you're formulating your next response, which takes emotional and intellectual energy. But then once you've dropped the response, then you're waiting in anxiety to see if it worked or not. And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't work. So it's just gonna be some next mess until one of you, it's a game of chicken, until one of you decides to sort of pull back. It's a miserable space to find yourself.
Well, and that's, so when I first made my video, I didn't know anything. I didn't appreciate YouTube as a social network until I had made that first video about Jordan Peterson that got a sufficient number of views, to which I began reading the comments, and I was, of course, sort of ready for, and there was some of that, but as a pastor, you get used to people saying ugly things, because this is church after all, and that's part of what we do in church, is we say ugly things and we have fights. And then I was reading the comments, and wow, I was learning from the people who were watching my videos. Many of them know more than me about, all kinds of things. And then, some people wanted to talk to me. And so, okay. And then, well, would others like to hear our conversation? Yes, they would. And maybe not millions, but, a few hundred, even a couple thousand sometimes. and off we go. And to discover that, one of the things that I began to discover is that this isn't church really,
Mm-hmm.
but there's ripples of it like it, because these are the kinds of conversations I like having within the church. And I say within the church not to necessarily mean the building, but within the body of Christ, where yeah, we've got some differences, and you're a Roman Catholic and I'm Dutch Reformed, but we're growing, and we're loving, and we're finding truth, and we're experiencing beauty. And so suddenly I said, oh, there's something to this thing. So let's see where it goes.
Right. Well, so here, this might be a bit of a lead in then. So one of the things I've discovered in the last little bit, I've posted some things on conspiracy theories on my Facebook. I wrote an article, which you might link to, on Church Life Journal. We won't go into all this today, but the article is about creationism, Catholic creationism as conspiracy theory. And I posted it, but then I also posted some things about conspiracy theories in general. And the basic angle was, look, debunking this or that conspiracy theory is valuable. We need to get our facts straight and our interpretation clear and solid, right? And defensible. But more than that, we need to, as a culture, get better at recognizing the pattern of what I call conspiracy theory thinking, right? And it's tricky. Most of us have an intuitive sense of it when we see it, especially when it's from someone we disagree with. We're less good at recognizing it when it's our own team. But it's slippery, and it's designed to be slippery. And we can go into that. But what I want to share now is when I started doing that on Facebook, I got attacked by some people. And no one wanted to refute them on the Facebook page, right? Because everyone has learned it's not worth the fight, right?
Right.
But I started getting private messages from people who even sometimes people who have left the church. I got a message from a woman who said, I grew up in a conspiracy theory family and community within the church, and it's made a lot of things really difficult for me as an adult. And it's made it actually an unsafe place for me to be in the church. And so even though I'm not in the church right now, I listen to your podcast, I read your stuff, and I'm really engaged and sort of consoled that because, and this is the interesting thing, she says, I know that this kind of truth seeking that you're modeling is actually what Catholicism is about. Yeah. But my own experience of conspiracy theory Catholicism has so shaped my emotional and psychological capacity and way of being in the world that I actually can't be in the church, even though I know that the truth of the church is actually much closer to what you're doing than to what this person who just bombed your Facebook is doing. Yeah. And so she thanks me for being church for her, even when she can't be in the church. Now, I can imagine what the antagonists on my Facebook are going to say to her. Like, suck it up, Buttercup, get back to church. You're in mortal sin, right? I'm just in no place to judge what she's capable of right now. But if I can be in a relationship where there's some outreach of the church to her in the place where she finds herself, like, praise God for that, right? Yeah. And other contexts from people who are, I got a buddy who's raised in a Muslim country, but he was always kind of like, he was never a really believing, practicing Muslim himself, and now he's basically a secular humanist living in Canada. And he is saying, like, hey, this is good witness that the church is, that you as a representative of the church are standing up for careful thinking and engagement in the public sphere that demands integrity. But one of the great concerns is how many Christians are doing the opposite. Yeah. And what is the witness to the world when Christians are disproportionately promoting conspiracy theory thinking? It gives a picture, right? It makes it very easy to imagine that other things like, I don't know, the resurrection, or the idea that the unborn are worthy of human rights, those all get a bad name because they look like conspiracy theories too by association. Now that's bad thinking on the parts of the other people. I'm not saying that's a justified move, but we're not helping our cause.
No, and that's right. And the obvious, I mean, when you use the word disproportionate, there's always the question of sample size, because in some ways social media is the child of mass media. And so, part of what we have going on in our society now is that we had mass media, which obviously in the Neil Postman amusing ourselves to death. We first had the rise of the newspaper, the printing press started this all, or you go all the way back to Plato when it was, writing. Oh, don't write words, please. You don't know where this is going to lead.
He wasn't totally wrong.
He wasn't totally wrong. No, let's give Plato his due. But, so then you had mass media, and now, the glory of the internet was that now you don't even need the printing press or the mimeograph machine or the computer printer. Now, the world can hear your words.
If I don't hold down shift when I press enter in a Facebook comment, I post the thing by accident, and then I got to retract it because I wasn't done writing.
Yes.
I mean, that's how bad it is, right?
I know.
Your point though about sample size is a good one. I mean, there's a couple things going on here, right? So a huge percentage, maybe most of my Facebook friends are Catholics and Christians. And so I'm going to see, more of them, not behaving themselves than of the secular humanists who also don't behave themselves, right? So, granted that. And I think there's another thing. I mean, let's say Christians are disproportionately represented in this by whatever number, right? Here's the bad thinking on the part of the secular humanists. That proves Christians are bad thinkers. Well, there's a lot of other variables. And this is one of the things conspiracy theories do very poorly, is take account of multiple variables. If there is a plausible explanation of a given data point that coincides with your way of thinking, you seize on it and you ignore the host of other variables, right? And then that becomes the sort of controlling interpretive mechanism for taking in other data. And that's illegit no matter who does it. But I mean, one other variable for Christians is, now this is an interesting, whether we're genuinely persecuted or not, and this is a whole other discussion, Christians at least have felt on the defensive in at least North American culture, but largely Western culture, for a few decades, and it's been loss after loss. And a lot of it is there was bad faith and bad methodology on the other side. And so if you have been at the receiving end of that for a few decades, it is easy to let your interpretive lenses stop being really critical and stop being concerned about a fully truthful and integrated representation, and to be concerned about winning. Yeah. And that's an understandable reaction. Christians need to work within our communities to overcome it. I think the cross tells us winning is less important than the truth. But we're all humans, and we're sick of being punching bags.
Yeah.
I had a friend of mine posted something saying, Christians, some percentage of Christians feel that they're persecuted. And it was kind of a ha-ha, right. And there's a valid point to be made, right? There are places in the world where Christians are getting killed, or their churches are being burned, where they're refugees because of legit violent persecution. And to compare ourselves with that when somebody loses a job or gets silenced on social media is a false equivalence. So there's a good point to be made that we're not really persecuted. On the other hand, I responded to her, I said, of course they feel like they're persecuted. Our whole political machinery requires that everyone feel like they're persecuted. So in the marriage wars, the LGBT community feels persecuted, and the Christian community feels persecuted, and both with some justification, because we treat each other terribly, and we do terrible things to each other in social media, and people on both sides lose their livelihood for disagreeing with someone who happens to hold power over them on this. Now, we can say who's losing more or not, but I think that misses the point. The point is, people get our votes by telling us that we are a persecuted minority and they will stand up for us. And that happens on the left and on the right. So of course we all feel persecuted, which makes us really incapable of engaging in a healthy way.
Yeah. Well, and I love how you brought in the multivariable thing, which we'll get into the conspiracy theory thing when we get there, which is very soon. But, one of the points that I often make is that, so we've got this, lately in my video, I've used Wilfrid Sellers' observation about the manifest image and the scientific image.
Okay.
Where the scientific image pulls out the ought and only can talk about what is, and tries to get a better handle on what is by pulling out the ought. But any human being who is playing around in the scientific image has to see that the scientific image is nested in the manifest image. And so, what we're seeing, and this will have a lot to do with the conspiracy thing, science says, and it's like, science doesn't say anything.
Right.
People are using science to say things. And part of the reason that the single variable is so powerful for us, and again, John Vervaeke gets into this relevance realization in terms of its relationship with intelligence, because, and this is sort of where the pragmatists come into play. Well, here in this moment, I must act, or I am going to speak. And by virtue of usually action and speaking, there's something that is at the top of the hierarchy. And so what I have to do in order to simplify the world is to temporarily create a distortion field which accentuates this one thing.
Right.
And the entire world then becomes a function of the hierarchy of that one thing.
Right.
And that is a distortion. It's
Bible calls it idolatry.
Yes, it is. It is. But it's also sort of a necessary distortion because of how and what we are in time.
Right.
And so all of that comes together. And so in a sense, when we mock, which is obviously another rhetorical device, when we mock those who play the victim card, well, the experience of being a victim is, of course, in many ways a function of experience, which is, of course, in many ways now deeply tied to before we had screens or newspapers even, our sense of our place in the world was partly determined by the very physicality of the world around us, sort of this natural, fairly stable natural environment of cows and grass and tumbleweeds and whatever. Then suddenly you add people to the mix, and now you've got social hierarchies, which are very determinative of one's sense of being a victim or a victor. And then you add newspapers that bring in more information from the world, and the complexity of the world rushes in. An assassination in Sarajevo suddenly ripples into the government sending a letter that says your 18-year-old son needs to show up at a certain time and undergo a training and be put in a ship and go to some battlefield in France and probably die.
Right.
So now suddenly the newspaper has salience. And we've just continued to multiply these things over time as our networks have gotten larger. And one of the things I forget, I made the point somewhere in one of my videos. Someone had made the observation that this gets into a bunch of things, but only in hindsight do people make documentaries that talk about the causes of World War I.
Right.
Because, well, for this woman of 2 sons on a farm in Iowa, the cause of World War I was the letter that came from the government.
Right.
Because what is World War I? And so, very quickly, things get far more complex than many of us care
than any of us can actually process, right? There is more data in the world than you and I could hope to process without our filters.
That's right.
And so having good filters is essential. And when new media are introduced that we haven't culturally developed filters for healthy engagement with, you're going to end up with, right? There's going to be a period of like chaos.
Yes.
Hopefully it's only a period. I mean, who knows? But there's this chaotic, and we are naive about the fact that we've got filters. In general, we imagine that reality is sort of straightforward and we're experiencing, right? So to go to your science being nested idea, right? A really naive sort of materialist can say, well, science just deals with this and that's the real world and that's how I approach it. And they don't realize they're making a claim that belongs in the manifest, which is science ought not deal with the ought. Right? Like you're living in a contradiction when you do that. But and it's really easy to miss your own filters, right? And I think one of the great gifts of monotheism, but let's even say Judeo-Christian worldview, is when I jumped in and said, like, the Bible calls that idolatry. Within this world, any number of things will vie for the prime position by which you interpret all other things. It becomes the lens through which everything else. So that could be science, that could be whatever else. And it will necessarily, as you put it, distort your approach to other things. I think what the worship of one God who is not part of the system, right? A God who is other than creation, has the function of relativizing then everything within creation, so that the distortion fields that those things put out that impact how you view other things should be dampened, because none of them gets the top spot.
Exactly.
But anytime anything else gets anytime anything in the system gets the top spot,
right?
Even if that's your image of God, because which happens all the time, and we're constantly in need of purifying our own image of God. Even if it's your image of God, that's going to create a distortion field that makes you less able to interpret the data that is overwhelming, right?
No, I think that's exactly right. And so in this weird new life of mine, someone pointed me to a YouTuber, Dark Matter 2525, who spends most of his channels creating these cartoons to mock Christianity, God, the Bible, theism, all of this stuff. And he's very clever and it's quite entertaining. But, one of the things, I've done a lot of thinking through my last 2 years of video work about, okay, what do we mean by this funny little word God? And isn't it awfully peculiar that these Hebrews, out of this huge menagerie of ancient Near East culture, somehow come out with this idea right at the top of the 10 Commandments: you shall not make a graven image. And it's like, well, gosh, you go look at the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Mesopotamians, and there's graven images all over the place.
Right.
What an insane idea.
Right.
To say you may not represent me. So now we've got a personal, and deep in this and once we get there, deep in this conspiracy theory conversation is the question, and this is part of the long conversation I've been having with John Vervaeke, is the question about agency.
Okay.
Because, you know, basically at the heart of every conspiracy theory is the idea, well, it's the Illuminati, or it's Bill Gates, or it's Barack Obama, or it's Donald Trump, or it's even worse, it's the hidden magnates of industry who, the founders of Google are only front men for the real powers behind the scenes. And so it's, and actually yesterday there's a guy on YouTube or a guy on Twitter that I've talked to, Neil Shenvi, who's very interesting. He's got a PhD in theoretical chemistry, I think it is, who his wife has a better paying job because he's an academic. And so he's a homeschooling dad of Indian descent. And he's just kind of developed a fascination and a blog about reading just tons and tons of critical race theory and critical gender theory and all of this stuff. And so he says, in some ways, critical theory is itself sort of a large conspiracy theory, but it doesn't focus on Bill Gates or Donald Trump or Barack Obama or the Democratic Party. It focuses on the agency of history.
Right.
That now racism, you have to, in a sense, turn racism into an agent, into a character, in order that now we can engage it as, and then off you go with critical race theory. So so what I really love about, and we're going to get to your list, I promise. I love, because he got tons of good stuff in it. I want to go through it because it's really helpful. But this question about conspiracy theory is not just about burning 5G cell towers in the UK and France, or that I'm not going to take a vaccine because Bill Gates. It, in fact, goes deeply into the questions of whose world is this, and whose is critical, because again, part of what happened in, I think part of, if you read the Metaphysical Club, makes the point very sharply. The real thing Darwin brings into the conversation is not, oh, here's another description of historical process that yields the kinds of outcomes we see in human bodies or plants or animals or Galapagos turtles or whatnot. The real key idea that Darwin plants is the process is blind.
Right.
So right here, and that's where sort of questions about evolution and questions about Bill Gates and 5G cell towers sort of meet. Because, and this is where my conversations with John Vervaeke sort of meet, because in a sense, the non-theist says it's, and so, there's no agency above us. Now, we afford ourselves agency in humanism. Individuals like Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett might try to debunk that, but, C.S. Lewis and many others said, they don't stick with it. Because you can't.
You can't live by it, right?
But that's where these conspiracy theories are, now that COVID has sort of disrupted our patterns, conspiracy theories, they're popping up, and many of us look at them and sort of snicker, unless one of our loved ones is really now captured by it.
This is the pastoral issue that I get, emails, Facebook messages, phone calls about, right? My sister is sharing all this stuff on Facebook. I don't know what to say or do, or this kind of thing. I really like this idea that there's conspiracy theory style thinking in some tellings of history that are sort of widely accepted in mainstream media and academia and whatever else. I think that's very interesting. I got a couple pieces I want to do, so I got to think about what order to do them in. A quick comment on Darwin and agency. And this might have to be another show that we do, because it's popped up over and over again. But for a Thomist, it's not a problem that there is randomness in creation, because God's agency is high enough to incorporate randomness and chance within the order in a way that's very analogous to accepting human freedom. Human freedom versus God's providence has a very similar resolution for Thomas as randomness and chance in creation and God's creative power, right? So saying at a given level there is randomness isn't a problem for a Thomistic understanding of God's relationship with creation. But that was largely absent at the time when it was introduced, right? Although there were some people who saw it very clearly. John Henry Newman was like, "Oh yeah, no, that's not a big problem," you know. But that's a bit of an aside. The thing I really wanted to jump on is there's a kind of primordial conspiracy in the garden, right? So, watch how the snake talks, right? It's not a statement; it's a question. Which is a conspiracy theory move, right? I'm gonna say something suggestive that includes a partial truth. And I'm gonna frame the question in such a way that you connect the dots, right? This is how, right? I'll say these three facts and I'll arrange them in such a way that you connect the dots. And then other interpretations of those facts are sort of become hard to see because of the way I framed it. And so the snake frames the question about the fruit and the tree in a way that's a sort of, now you connect the dots, but it wasn't a neutral frame at all. It was a totally biased frame. And it was about the ill intent of the powers that be, which is classic conspiracy theory thinking, right? That's right. So the most powerful one, I'm going to ask you a question in a frame that makes you think that maybe he didn't have your good in mind. Maybe he didn't, and I'm going to say things that are true. They may not be relevant or they may not apply in the way that they should with a correct interpretation, but they're hard to falsify. There's something true about them. So I'll say that, and then you do what you will with the information, which I have so graciously bestowed upon you because I am the one who tells the truth, right? The snake is the conspiracy theorist, and God is the power that is being questioned and whose ulterior motives are sort of supposedly laid bare for Adam and Eve, right?
Yes. Well, and the book of Job.
Yeah.
You know, the book of Job, and let's say the Eddie Murphy, Dan Aykroyd movie, Trading Places.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that one, but I know Job.
Well, Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy did a movie about, so Eddie Murphy is a kind of a hustling street dweller, and Dan Aykroyd is a son of privilege. And these two old geezers who are at the top of the hierarchy are having a nature-nurture bet. And one of them says, I bet I can take that dude on the street and send him to the top of the hierarchy if I give him the benefits that you have given your beloved privileged white son, I forget his name, Wilfred or something like that. And so, I've been wandering around earth. What have you seen? Well, have you considered my servant Job? Oh, of course he's moral. Look at how he can afford morality. Right. Oh, well, take away his stuff, but don't touch his life. I mean, and off you go in that book. And so, the questions that, and I'm about to screen share your list here. The questions that we're dealing with and the ways of thinking go far beyond, will I take a vaccine because Bill Gates?
Right. No, there's a deeper question with the human approach to reality, authority, agency. That means conspiracy theory thinking is a basic problem in human thinking from the beginning. Yeah. It's that we're in a particular context that has really amped up its visibility, its plausibility, its attractiveness, and those kinds of things. So yeah, if we want to do the screen share, I mean, basically there's two kinds of problems. One is, what is conspiracy theory thinking and why do we need to get good at recognizing it? And then the second kind of problem is, and my screen share, or the document I sent you is gonna be way sketchier on this, but it's kind of some things we've already talked about is why is it attractive now? What kind of pastoral problem is it? What kind of responses, should we have to it? That kind of thing, right?
Yeah, no, and so go for it.
Okay. So I mean, one of the problems when you label something conspiracy theory thinking is that can get immediately dismissed as you just failed to engage. You dismissed me by calling me a conspiracy theorist or calling this or that point I've put up on Facebook conspiracy style thinking. You've just dismissed me, and I'm just going to straight up admit that happens. People do just dismiss other people, sometimes justly and sometimes unjustly, right? I mean, either whether it was an actual critical insight that should have been engaged that was dismissed, or if it was genuine conspiracy theory thinking that should have been dismissed, the person still feels the same way, that this has been used as a way to dismiss them, and so now they're allergic to any discussion of it at all, right?
Right.
And so they will say things like, well, if what you're talking about is just logical fallacies and bad thinking, why introduce this language of conspiracy style thinking at all? Why is it helpful if all it is something that people can use to dismiss other people? So I accept that. People shouldn't use it just to dismiss, but I still think it's valuable. This category is valuable for us to think about because it's a special kind of logical fallacy, or it's a set of logical fallacies. And it's a pattern that generally happens together. There's a series, and we'll go into that lower in the document. It's a kind of thing that happens together, and we need to get good at recognizing the pattern. But also, one of the things that I think defines it as a subset of logical fallacies is that it is a series of logical fallacies that have kind of inoculated itself from reason. So it anticipates the response and then preemptively strikes. So if you watch the Plandemic thing, it has a preemptive strike at the end. Look, they're going to take this down because it's true, right? And there's this interpretive loop that gets very convoluted. So I think we need particular training in thinking about conspiracy theories because they've made a preemptive strike sort of against reason, and they've got various mechanisms to inoculate themselves against critical engagement, which we'll look at some of those more specifically below. But that's why I think we need that good definition of them.
Well, I think that's helpful, because one of the things, I mean, even just for me mentioning Bill Gates, sort of what has happened because of my YouTube channel, because I now more people are listening to what I have to say. If I mockingly mention Bill Gates, I verbalized a tell that locates me within communities of trust.
Right.
And again, this is the same thing with the woman of the church that you talked about. And it's the same thing, even just mentioning the Plandemic video, because it's really important to recognize. I actually talked about this in a sermon a little while, and so I just Googled conspiracy theories that turned out to be true.
Right.
In the 1950s, body parts of children who had died came up missing. And where did the arm of my boy go? And it wound out that, the US government wanted some young cadavers from young persons to do experiments on radiation, because they're trying to figure out exactly what radiation did. And so they were kind of stealing body parts from young
Right.
cadavers. And it's like, you know, and if yeah, the hand of your son who died in a horrible accident, and you're grief stricken, and the arm is missing, and someone comes to you and says the U.S. government took it.
Right.
You'd say, no, come on, it was probably hurt in the accident, and the mortician couldn't repair it. And you create some plausible story in order to defend the reputation of the U.S. government, because for whatever reason, whether founded or unfounded, you had perhaps a psychological reason to trust authority.
Right. Unless you already had a reason to be suspicious of the government, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And so it's, part of this, and this is where I want to, keep in mind that the science, the logic image is also nested in the manifest image.
Right.
In that so often we deeply believe within communities of trust. And so, and you see this right now in American politics deeply, because all I have to do is say Donald Trump, and it's like, it's like dropping that little bit of soap into the oily dishpan, and
Right.
Because and on one hand we say, oh, it's I think logically. There's this YouTuber named Rationality Rules who has these cards about fallacies, and you make an argument, and he loves to just plunk down cards on people, and it's like, yeah, you're playing a game too, because we can't help but believe within communities of trust.
Right.
So if I mention Herman Bavinck, or you mention Thomas Aquinas, these things are always together, but yet these are powerful tools that we have in terms of, well, these are fallacies, and let's begin to look at the patterns of thinking, but those patterns are also nested in, every now and then something happens which is, well, it's really crazy. And so these conspirators who were quite hapless, who really wanted to, these anarchists who believe that out of anarchy, a new, better world order. Well, the anarchist conspiracy that caused World War I was remarkably successful in terms of an anarchist conspiracy theory, because chaos was unleashed. Well, didn't end up exactly where they wanted it to, but go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So, this is why my first point is, what is conspiracy theory thinking then? It's not any thinking that imagines a conspiracy. There are real conspiracies in the world. I think most of us, if we were to read about the ways in which Russian bots are shaping political division in North American Twitter, would think there's probably something to that. The evidence seems pretty good. I think most of us, it's pretty clear that Big Tobacco covered up what they knew about the health impacts of tobacco for as long as they possibly could. Right? There are genuine, real conspiracies in the world. And so one of the things that the conspiracy theorist says when you push back is, they say, well, you're not asking critical questions. I'm the one who asks critical questions. And we want to say, no, the critical questions are good. Let's learn how to ask critical questions well, because there actually are conspiracy theories. But the thing, and this is where it gets confusing in the terminology, right? The thing that has uncovered actual conspiracies has not been conspiracy theory thinking. The thing that uncovers actual conspiracies is solid investigative technique, getting your facts right, clear interpretation, good logic, right? Like those things uncover conspiracies. Conspiracy theory thinking doesn't. It may on occasion coincide with the findings of those other things, but that's a fluke. It's not, right? And that really messes with your interpretation, because you're like, oh, I believe this conspiracy from the start and it turned out to be true. Therefore, all my thinking patterns are justified.
Define fluke.
Well, let's say I do a math I do a math problem.
And you get it
and
right, even though you couldn't follow the steps.
I couldn't follow the steps. I make a mistake in part A, and I'm off track. And then in part D, I make another mistake that counters my mistake, and I end up with the right answer, but I don't actually understand the math. Right. If there is a big question, right, the relationship of Russia to the
2016 election,
last American election, there's going to be conspiracy theory style thinking on both sides.
Right.
There's going to be bad thinking.
Right.
One of those sides is going to end up to be basically right. And then they will say, my thinking is therefore justified.
Right. But we also return to the univariable problem in that, I don't have any, it's completely believable to me that the Russians would like to influence the elections. Everybody on Facebook wants to influence the election.
Yeah, exactly.
The Russians have a little bit more, a few more means, and they probably did influence the election. And so did my mom, who keeps posting Facebook posts.
Right.
Well, so she and the Russians, although, it's a conspiracy theory that the Russians were doing it, and it isn't that my mom was doing it. And
you get caught in definitions of influence, like how much influence and whatever else. And then the conspiracy theorist on either side, and this is key for understanding conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theorist on either side will define the terms so that they were proved right.
Right.
Actual conspiracy theory thinking is unfalsifiable. That's part of what makes it the kind of thing it is that it will always find an interpretive mechanism for, if not being proved right, at least for leaving the question open. It will never be definitively foreclosed that it was wrong. And that's part of the definition. And you can see the kind of the framing, the various framing tools we'll look at that are a little lower on the document that allow it to function this way. I sent you a quote by G.K. Chesterton. I don't know if you have it handy. I don't have it right in front of me, but he talks about arguing with a madman. And he says the madman in some ways is extremely logical. But the circle of logic is very tiny.
Yes. I love that quote.
You can't argue him out of this tiny circle of logic because it is internally consistent. What he doesn't need another argument, he needs fresh air.
Yes.
Paraphrase, right?
And again, that gets into Chesterton was just a genius with how he framed things. And in a sense, this gets into the question of human capacity. What he needs to do is, because I'm convinced that my mother influenced the election, except the guy, the woman she wanted to win didn't. But doggone it, on her Facebook page, and she's going to listen to this. I'm going to get crap for it, I know. But doggone it, if my mother didn't try to flip the 2016 election Hillary's way, but this gets into. Go ahead.
Sometimes we're our own worst enemies.
Yeah.
Right. One of the difficulties with conspiracy theory thinking, one of the ways to try to appeal to someone who's engaging in this, if I want to engage with my fellow Christian, I want to say, like, I also think that the way that the mainstream media and our government, at least in Canada, talks about abortion is really problematic and deeply suspicious and covers up a lot of things, right? And is but I don't think the angle that is being played here is actually going to help us get there. If it makes us less plausible as a public entity disputing this way of interpreting, we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah. Well, and I think this gets into part of why we enjoy this. It is emotionally satisfying that I know that COVID was something perpetrated on the American people to ruin Trump's economy so he wouldn't be reelected. That was what does this mean? That out of all of this sea of information and thinkers and choosers out there, I and perhaps me and my group alone know the truth. And, as religious people in institutional churches, we recognize this dynamic a lot. It's emotionally very satisfying that, we here in the Christian Reformed Church, sorry, Catholics, we really got it right. And you're good, and I'll accept you in the Christian fold, but someday you'll grow up and say, doggone it, I wish I had joined the Christian Reformed Church. And it's just so
Right.
It's one of these ways that we, one of the ways that we BS ourselves.
Right.
But I'm distracting, and I think you've got some great stuff here, so I want to go through it.
Well, okay, so let's scroll down a little bit, and I'll just jump on that. I don't have this point till later, so we don't need to scroll all the way down. But
Okay.
One of the things about conspiracy theory thinking is it's generally informed by the sense that I'm both a hero and a victim. Right? Like, I'm taking a stand against the powers that be. I'm braving Facebook by saying things that are unpopular. I'm getting beat up. I'm not getting engaged in a fair way. And there's something deeply attractive to people about seeing themselves as heroes and as victims. And it's a moral justification for the position before it's an intellectual justification for the position, right? So this is one of the things that threw me off certain conspiracy theorist style thinking, including my dad's creationism, is that when I read it, it didn't seem to lead with the intellectual argument. It seemed to lead with the other guys are bad guys and we're the good guys. And I was like, that smells funny. That doesn't smell like science to me. That smells like something else that is taking some claims of science or purported scientific claims and putting them in service of some other narrative. And this hero victim narrative is really a key component to this kind of thinking, right?
Yep.
Okay, a couple other things. Okay, what is conspiracy theory thinking? It's not just anything that believes a conspiracy. It's designed to be unfalsifiable. It's often or generally the content is about a powerful secretive group or individual who's behind some events or patterns, right? The mainstream interpretation is controlled by a powerful group. That's not strictly necessary for the form of a conspiracy theory thinking, but it's generally the content of it. What did I put for my last one here? I've said this already. It's important to debunk this or that fact, but the real question is the pattern. What's the pattern? So that's what I have in the next sort of chunk of bullets is different sort of flags to say, hey, either I'm participating in this kind of thinking, or the thing I'm sharing or the thing I'm engaging with is this kind of thinking, right? Ill intent is presumed. We don't, right? Most people would think that even if Bill Gates does things that lead to unforeseen negative consequences, he was probably trying to do good. Right. But the conspiracy theory says he's nefariously plotting, right? Which is not to say that no one has ever nefariously plotted.
Or that Bill Gates hasn't done so.
Right, exactly. Right. So none of this is right. You can't turn it around and say, therefore, the opposite is true. Whenever anyone's trying to do good, ill intent is impossible. No, this is part of what makes it slippery, right? Is that it can be true some of the time, and it has been true on occasion. Details are singled out and given one interpretation, right? So one that's going up around COVID is that the hospitals get paid a certain amount of money for treating a COVID patient. Well, what's the only reasonable interpretation? That the government is paying doctors to make false positive diagnoses to inflate the numbers. Now, people who work in hospitals will tell you, well, no, you just need a number for any given thing that gets treated. That's how you do the paperwork to make sure that the money keeps going in and out when things that cost money are being performed in hospitals. And so if you want to say it's nefarious, you gotta dig and say, what do other things cost and how does the money get in and how is the decision made about how much money and right? You got to actually do all of that work and look at all the variables.
Yeah.
The conspiracy theory thinking doesn't look at the variables. It says, here's one detail I'm going to zoom in on. I will presume one interpretation, and then that interpretation controls my interpretation of everything else.
And it's important to recognize that, well, let's say you're in a hospital and the hospital isn't doing very well financially. And now let's say the state of California says it's going to make sure that all COVID patients are covered. Well, and some administrator is going to be like, gosh, we got all these uninsured people who come through our hospital and by law we have to treat them. So let's just call them all COVID. We don't imagine that has happened anywhere. I wouldn't be surprised if it does. But again, it gets blown up to, this COVID was not a scheme by Democrats to ruin Trump's economy. It was a scheme by hospitals. It's big medicine to make sure all of their uninsured people get covered by taxpayer money. It's really socialized medicine. I mean, again, we could play this game all day long.
Right. And well, so the I think 100% there can be an incentive to diagnose something for money. And this existed long before COVID, because in many, many cases, right, pneumonia, the flu, whatever, when people die, it's a judgment call very often. I mean, okay, you get shot in the head, that's a clear-cut case. But you're old and you got 20 things wrong with you, and this bug is the one that finishes you off. How do you articulate that for a system that needs to put it in one slot in the spreadsheet and dole out one denomination of money? It's a problem that's inherent in classifying death from the start, which can always lead to imprecisions in data. Could it be misused here by someone with nefarious intent? It could be. Could it be contributing to something through completely good intentions? Almost certainly. Does it point to a high-level conspiracy by either the government or big medicine and ill intent through a whole series of actors? I have no reason to believe that. Yeah. Right? But one of the things that conspiracy theory thinking is going to do is it's going to say, that's possible, and the burden of proof is now on you to disprove it. Right. So I will make a wild and exorbitant claim that might be true, and it's difficult or impossible to disprove. I have almost no evidence for it except one really outlandish interpretation of one piece of data. But until you can demonstrate the whole thing is false, and sometimes it comes down to proving a negative, which is logically impossible, then I'm going to hold to it. And that's a classic move. And another classic move you pointed to, you might float two different conspiracy theories that are mutually incompatible for the same data, and it doesn't bother you in the slightest. Because the real point isn't which conspiracy theory is right and which set of data and interpretation is right. It's only that something is wrong. Right. And I will say as much as I can to leave open the possibility that something is wrong without ever actually having to prove my assertions, right? So it's assertion piled on assertion, mutually contradictory, followed by a question. Are you connecting the dots? If you don't see the problem here, then you are the problem, right? These framings that go back to the snake in the garden that put the burden of proof in the wrong direction, right?
Yeah. Well, and I love, okay. Person dies of a heart attack. Cause of death, McDonald's. Person dies of diabetes. Cause of death, Coca-Cola. All these diabetes cases, well, this is, but again, I love how you're framing this, because, okay, ill intent is the source of this. And so often as I'm working through, all this crazy philosophy and psychology and history and theology, when you get down to the pastoral nub for so many people, well, do you think there is a God or isn't a God? Well, I'm increasingly convinced that so much of contemporary atheism is looking at the pain in the world and saying, it's just not plausible that existence as I see it can be attributable to, I don't want to say it's attributable to ill intent. I can't say it's attributable to good intent. So I'm going to say there's no intent.
Right.
And what's interesting is that, again, making these kinds of calculations is clearly impossible. But at least on some level, it's hard to argue that you and I haven't lived lives that are remarkably stable, comfortable, enjoyable, and pleasurable as compared to the vast majority of human beings that have lived before us, even as short as 100 years ago.
Or even, I mean, to a lesser degree, even people who live contemporary with us.
Right, right. And so why is it, and this is, again, subject of my more recent videos, why is it that Black folks who myself and my father spent a lot of time, in ministry with, folks in the Appalachia, Haitians in the third world, illegal Haitians in the Dominican Republic, where I spent 7 years working with. Why is it that these groups of people who live demonstrably less stable, more chaotic, harder lives than I do, somehow don't fall victim to what might be construed as sort of a conspiracy theory within their final religious decisions and say, I think at the heart of the world that there is a benevolent creator who, even though now for a while we suffer, will at some point somehow balance the scales of the universe and bring this sad world to joy and glory. Very interesting.
Right, right. Yeah, no, it's there. I mean, at the same time that we can see justification for belief at a natural level on a whole range of things, we can also see a kind of I don't know, a miracle of grace on other things, right? So I'm thinking of the graven images thing that you brought up about the Israelites. What happened that made that interpretation possible? And one of the things that Christianity has done and said, done for the poor, said about the poor, is that they have and not before Christianity, Judaism, they have a vantage point to see through structures of power that we who benefit from the structures don't. Yes. Now that seems like postmodern theorizing, but it's actually what the Israelites do in the desert.
Yes, yes.
What's his name? The rabbi in London, Jonathan Sacks.
Yeah.
Calls the Old Testament a polemic against power because it's a story told from the point of view of the weak and the poor.
Yeah.
Right. And that gives us the lenses to say that the power structure of this world actually, well, first to recognize what they are, and then to say that they are not ultimate. Yeah. So on the one hand, you can say, well, religion is a fairy story that people believe to console themselves when their life is hard, and I don't deny it. That's quite possible, right? And on the other hand, the suffering actually see things and have a vantage point that we don't, and we all know this ourselves when we suffer.
Yes.
Right? It's
yes.
not, I'm not just speculating about other people who are suffering different things than me. The generic poor person or the generic victim of violence. But even in my own life, I gain perspective from suffering about the way the world works. Right? So like there's a both and in there. It's not just and this is part of why Christianity insists that our own image of God is always needing to be purified, because we recognize that on top of the moment of grace that gives us clarity, there is always the the other self, the old Adam, if you want to call it that, that is doing the interpretation for the reason that the atheist critiques us. I mean, the thing about the atheist critique of Christianity in, I don't know, let's say 17th, 18th century Europe, is that the church fathers had made the same bloody critiques themselves. They were aware of the human condition. You know, it's like, it's not new. Anyway, maybe that's a little.
No, it's sorry. I shouldn't. I'm just way too ADHD, and I keep distracting from the main point.
That's good. That any argument against the mainstream argument is therefore good. So I shared with you a Facebook post, a screen capture of a post that said something that was like clearly false. And then one person underneath said, this is wrong. And the response was, I don't believe you. You believe everything that, people.
Right.
Then a second person weighed in and said, I know this is false because my husband went to the hospital and got tested, and that's the result that this says would happen didn't happen.
Yeah.
And the reaction was, false negatives, right? I don't trust the test. My interpretive lens is so determinative that your experience of this must be explained by false negative. Now, what's going on here? Would this person's conspiracy fall apart if they were wrong on that particular point? Not necessarily. It's just that any argument against the mainstream and in favor of the conspiracy theory is therefore a good argument. It's this sort of scattershot methodology, like just throw one argument out after another. If it is definitively refuted, I mean, sometimes you just deny it. Like, I hear it's definitively refuted and I reject it anyways because you're one of the conspirators or you're duped. Those are the two options, by the way, for people who disagree with you. They're either conspirators themselves or they've been duped, right? Which gives you an interpretive lens to dismiss anything. This is one of the ways that the conspiracy theory inoculates itself, is by calling into question the motives or the intelligence of anyone who questions you from the beginning, right? So if you question, this is really ironic. You question a conspiracy theory on Facebook, and what you're told is, well, you would believe that because you believe everything you read on the internet. And you're like, but the thing I just read on the internet, I didn't believe, and I asked a critical question about. Like, what happened there? Like, it's this very convoluted kind of, rhetoric, but it inoculates the theory from being challenged, and it tells the person holding the theory that they are the only critical thinker, right? That's part of what goes on, which makes actual engagement impossible.
Right.
If the other person is a conspirator or a patsy, anything they say will not be engaged. But then as a conspiracy theorist, you say, no one will engage me. And, right? So it's just insulated. And then you complain that no one will engage, but you make it impossible for people to engage. Yeah. And so that just reinforces more and more of what's going on, right? It's just, and this is why it's so frustrating to try to engage, because you're sort of thwarted at every turn, right? And another one, I'm not sure if I mentioned this yet, is the failure to distinguish between the falsifiable and the verifiable and the unverifiable. So you make verifiable claims and you make unverifiable claims. And if the verifiable claims get falsified, it doesn't matter, because you can fall back on your non-verifiable claim. You always have a safety net, so that you can put out any kind of wild claim you want, and you don't have to worry that it's going to get disproved, because if it is, you're safe anyways. You've built it so that doesn't matter, right? So you can either just say, I don't care that it's been refuted because it's irrelevant, or you can say, I don't believe that it's been refuted anyways. Either will work, right?
Right. Well, and I think, to me, again, this all gets back to, and I love how this maps, in a sense, from Genesis 3, boy, you can get to a lot.
Yes.
That, I think about C.S. Lewis's quip about hell. The door to hell is locked from the inside. I mean, the door, I simply must believe that the Illuminati is at, I simply must believe this. And if I don't, you know, I won't let go of this, which again, I think leads to, you know, some of the early stuff we started talking about, all of these little pastoral skill things. And so you bump up against, you know, and you run into this all the time on the internet, because again, I think social media, these patterns get magnified. And so you bump into someone in a comment section that every single conversation with this person ends the same way.
Right, right.
And so we get bored talking to them, unless we say want to bring someone else and say, see you, let me show you something. You poke the button and the same thing happens. You say, hey, look, see, I made him do it again. Watch me do it again. How about this over here? Boom, same answer. And again, this gets down to me to this, you know, also, sorry to bring John Vervaeke into the conversation so off. He, in his, if you think you know, well, he has this 50 hours on YouTube, which is his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis thing. But at one point, he's dealing with some theories of addiction, and he's connecting it with Buddhism. And he has this really interesting idea of reciprocal narrowing. And this gets to Chesterton's idea about arguing with a madman. What happens with an addict is that their world continues just to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. I once had an alcoholic sit across my office from me, and in a moment of insight, took the can of beer that he was sipping as he was talking to me, puts it on the table, and says, you know, my life is in this can. And his whole world had come down to this thing. And so, you know, if there's reciprocal narrowing, where we keep, in Vervaeke's terms, we keep thinking in these self-deceptive ways. And your conspiracy theories are very much that way. You know, it's this pattern of thinking that reciprocally narrows to the degree that Bill Gates is the devil and I can't stop thinking about him.
Right. Right.
Donald Trump is the devil and I can't stop thinking about him. Every conversation I'm going to have is going to have the words Donald Trump in it. And I keep thinking, well, he kind of wins, doesn't he?
Right, right. Yeah, or intersectionality.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, take your pick, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Whatever,
And so then to me, okay, so then what are we made for? And what does the gospel afford? Well, and what is the age to come? I think it's the opposite of reciprocal narrowing. It's reciprocal enlarge, broadening, enlarging. And we think about one of the things that has interested me lately is that there's just a whole group of you'll have time to watch these if you have any interest and if you watch TV or not, but a whole group of programs about the afterlife. There was The Good Place that was on network TV, and on Amazon streaming, there's Upload. And what's interesting about many of these, okay, why are we working on these things now? Because in a sense, we've divorced God out of the picture. And so it's just us doing the thinking. And we begin to realize that the human being is too shallow a pool to actually afford the aspirations of the human heart. And I think you sort of get down to Augustine here.
Right, right.
And that all of these, you know, so we cannot conceive of eternity and a blessed afterlife, because if you listen to the celebrity atheist, well, we'll just get bored.
Right.
And you say, yeah, you probably will if all you are reduced to are your own resources.
Is it in The Great Divorce where Lewis, with the bus trip from hell, where when they arrive in heaven, they're tiny?
Yes.
Like
yes.
they're just so, right? They're in like a wastebasket in the corner, like, or he might use that image in another place. But anyways.
No, because someone tries to take something from the visiting world and get it back on the bus, and the angel basically says, there's no room on the bus.
It won't fit. Yeah.
Because you're trying to get something that is real to a place that is this reciprocal narrowing of, it's Bill Gates.
Right. I mean, so one of the things that conspiracy theories do is they try to put meaning on randomness that's not there.
Yes.
Because the world is scary, and so there's a discomfort with mystery, and there's a need for explanation of everything, and it has to fit within a certain tight interpretive frame. But the problem is because it won't work, and this goes to the psychology of addiction. The imagined solution is to make the frame smaller, when the actual solution is to make the frame bigger.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But once you're caught in the cycle, it gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and it closes down. And so ironically, all this information, this overwhelming amount of information that we can't possibly process, becomes in the minds of some really easy to explain. Yeah. And one of the remarkable things about conspiracy theories is they operate on this premise that, like, if you would just look, you'd see it. Like, it's just so obvious, right? So at the same time, it's shrouded in mystery. It's hidden by all these powerful people who don't want you to know the truth. And if you look at this graph on Facebook, the whole world becomes clear. I mean, it's this strange tension in the conspiracy theorist's mind between it's huge and complex, and who knows how deep it goes, and there's so many powers, and it's been going on for years, and et cetera, and it's crystal clear. If you just look at, like, these 3 Facebook posts, you'll know what's going on in the world. Right. And I think this maps really neatly onto what you're talking about this reciprocal narrowing pattern. It's inherently contradictory, but it's kind of psychologically necessary if you're on that road. And it's really, and like addiction, it's really tough to break out of it, because you need a different frame of reference, which goes to the Chesterton quote, right?
Right. And it gets into, it gets into Augustine's great quote. I mean, I actually have it on my wall. I've had it on my wall for years. I mean, nothing can satisfy one who would not be satisfied with God. Okay. Well, when people who have a reduced idea of God hear that, they're thinking about the little cartoon figure in Dark Matter 2525's thing opening up. They're thinking about this representation that they have. And when you actually think about, well, what exactly is the Bible talking about? How could we be satisfied with God? Well, in some ways, and this is where certain representations of the age that we struggle, as a preacher, I struggle with, well, how do I attempt to give my parish, my congregation, an image of the promise that they have been given, that will be powerful enough to help them begin to deny the reciprocal narrowings that are so endemic to our context. Well, you can have, let's say, the beatific vision from Dante, where you've got Beatrice, and I remember in seminary having a very interesting argument with an African about whether or not the life in the age to come will include things like basketball or bowling or movies or things like that. It's an interesting conversation, because this particular individual, who was a graduate student in theology, very much was taken by Dante, but when I think about that image, it's almost like us looking at our screens. Whereas when I think about how before the conspiracy of Genesis 3 did the pre-fall Adam and Eve worship God in the garden? And it's psychological, it's mental, it's engaging, it's, as some would say, it's a flow state, but it's also the world is not diminished in its perfection. Rather, it's, you know, and we don't have the language for it. I don't have the language for it.
Right.
And so here in this conspiracy theory, right there in Genesis 3 and all the things that we can tie to it, we also see the opposite of it. And again, Chesterton's quote is just dramatic in that, because, and so is Lewis's image from The Great Divorce. Well, what is the way out of a conspiracy theory?
Right. And in some ways, it's the human condition. One of the books I read on this, and I started researching this because I was talking with my bishop that this is becoming a pastoral problem, and maybe clergy and bishops need some formation on this. And I was thinking, you know, we should bring in a speaker. And he said, well, why don't you start doing some research? And so I did. And this is where a lot of the points I've brought up, right? The different logical or illogical patterns emerge. But I read a book called Suspicious Minds by a guy who did his doctorate in psychology on conspiracy theory thinking. And his contention is that we're all conspiracy theorists. There are degrees, but it's a subtle, which goes to the point in the garden, right? He doesn't make this point, but I mean, if the Bible frames this in the garden, then it's saying that it's something that's true of all of us to one degree or another.
Yes.
It's a kind of it's a grasping after certainty or control that is actually beyond us as humans. It's a certain kind of grasping for divinity that we would know all and we would control all, and it can take the form of a really obvious conspiracy theory that has, you know, what is it, David Icke, who's got like our reptilian overlords who are controlling the Vatican, and he does like these 10-hour like I don't know, expositions, let's call them. I mean, it can be that kind of thing, or it can be something like the story that we currently tell about how the modern world came to be the modern world, where the church is the bad guy and science overcame superstition and whatever else.
The Da Vinci Code.
Pardon me?
The Da Vinci Code.
The Da Vinci Code, right? There can be and there can be more or less extreme versions, but in our storytelling, there's this desire for control and for omniscience that is not, well, I mean, the fruit in the garden. This is not for us to have. It's not proper to our station. When we grasp after it, we miss the glorious thing that we are and the relationship that we had as creatures, because we're grasping after a kind of divinity that's not ours and won't make us happy if it must be had on our own terms, right? But I mean, it's interesting. This guy's a secular researcher, but his analysis of the human condition it maps quite neatly onto a biblical understanding of the human need or false need or perceived need for control and knowledge that is beyond us. And here's the Christian story, right? We can actually experience those things to some degree in this life and to an unimaginable degree in the next life in communion with the real God, if we accept the possibility of our limitations and our but just accepting the possibility of mystery, that this is beyond us. But when we can't do that, we get locked in.
Yeah.
And that's that picture, right? So I think it really does map onto a sort of Christian anthropology.
Well, and I think it's, so you know, you and I did quite a bit of negotiating via email about this conversation, and I certainly wasn't anxious about it in any way, because I knew it was going to be a great conversation however it went. But I think in many ways the conversation has sort of achieved some of what I hope it has achieved, some of what you wanted out of it, which was an explication of, now let's go to higher resolution on this kind of thinking, because it's a brand of thinking, and it's one of these patterns that we can fairly easily fall into and
learn to recognize.
and
with
learn to
that.
recognize.
Yeah.
And I guess my goal for the conversation is, yes, I want us to know that, but here's, and I think again Chesterton makes this wonderfully clear in his illustration. In many cases, and I find this pastorally, in many cases, find a conspiracy theorists and lay out the logical fallacies that they are violating by their conspiracy thinking. And it does nothing to them.
Right.
And so then, I mean, the broader pastoral question that I think you and I are wrestling with in terms of, okay, how can we help people? How can we help people not only from the COVID-19 conspiracy theorizing that we see going on now? This pandemic will at some point pass away, but how can we help? How can we help people? Generally speaking, I mean, we can give them a vaccine perhaps for this particular pandemic,
Right.
but and what I really wanted to explore with you, and I think I've really enjoyed this conversation, and it's been really helpful for me, is seeing how this really does map onto far larger things that we in the church attempt to bless people with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I really loved how you mapped this onto Genesis 3, because what would we like for other people? Is it a conspiracy theory from these evil church people that really want to enhance their own tribe? I want you to be part of the Christian Reformed Church, or I want you, maybe I'll soften that up, and I want you to identify as Christian, and I want you here in my own little, I want you to subscribe to my channel and like my videos, or pay tithes, or identify as Roman Catholic and vote that way, especially because that's the thing that I'm worried about, and on and on and on and on and on. And what I'd really love for you is that you might have life and life abundant.
Right. And this is the right. So when the beloved family member, friend, member of the congregation is engaging in this stuff on social media, it can't be primarily a concern to refute them because it's wrong. Underlying that, there's a pastoral concern. There's a person who is anxious, who is afraid of something, who has often, not always maybe, but often legitimate concerns that need addressing. This isn't, in a vacuum. And so, I mean, like with any argument, you can win the argument and lose the soul, right? And so, I mean, I had a friend call me who she saw me, debunking some stuff, and this is a big part of my audience that I worry about, right? Includes a lot of really reasonable people who aren't sort of full-fledged, but they're seeing things and they're like, but I wonder, I like what, I mean, my own prime minister, I think, has dictatorial pretensions. He kicked all the pro-lifers out of his party. He wouldn't let a Catholic summer camp, if they wanted to hire students using a government program, had to sign some declaration about being pro-choice. I mean, it was nonsense, right? I mean, it really dictatorial, totalitarian. I don't deny for a second that Justin Trudeau has totalitarian tendencies. It's really easy then for people who have suspicions about Trudeau that are justified to map this onto, why does he want us all locked in our house so that we can't do anything? He wants to destroy the economy so he has more control, et cetera, et cetera. These people phone me and they're on the edge. Yeah. And so those people, I think, can be shown, can learn to recognize conspiracy theory thinking and how it doesn't work at the intellectual level. But here's the more important pastoral point. It's something that we call in the Catholic tradition, I don't know what you call it, we call it the discernment of spirits. St. Ignatius Loyola is the guru on this, right? And it's reflecting on what happens in my interior life when I spend all day on Facebook and when I spend the day flying kites with my kids, right? What happens? What happens to me when I am engaging in this conspiracy theory theorizing and expositing and reading and whatever? Ignatius, it's not 100%, right? Because this doesn't guarantee that every conspiracy theory is false or everything about it is false. But in general, if something is amping up your anxiety, taking you away from your obligations, taking away your peace, taking away your relationship with God, and leaving you in a state that is unsustainable, that needs maybe medicating or self-medicating or whatever, then maybe it's the evil one. Maybe this isn't of God, right? And I think that's real. It's that pastoral, like, let's learn to reflect at the end of our day. And this is what Ignatius taught, right? Is the daily examine. At the end of your day, what brought you consolation? And that doesn't mean just what made you feel good, warm fuzzies, but a deeper peace. And what brought you desolation? What set you on edge? What took you away from God? Sometimes the hard things can be consolation because you find God in them, right? But are you finding God in your social media use? And so, like, the advice I'm giving to some people when they phone is like, let's just take a week off of social media and reflect on our interior state, and then decide from there, because that's really important data to work with, right? So there's that spiritual, and this is effectively, this is Chesterton's breath of fresh air, or it's your talk with Vervaeke. This is the reciprocal enlarging,
reciprocal broadening
rather than narrowing, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a spiritual question.
Well,
if we only fight it with intellectual tools, which are necessary, but
yes.
if we only fight it with intellectual tools, we're going to lose.
Yes.
That won't do it, right?
Yes. Yeah, they need to be practical tools. They need to be storified. But I think it's also important to recognize that in terms of the sampling of our population, there's an element of church culture that is, to go back to a point that you made earlier, there's an element of church culture that tends to attract people who have a weakness to conspiracy thinking. Because, there's a reason why churches, and, this is at least as true and I'll talk about my own house, at least as true in the Protestant camp. I mean, you can draw a crowd and cultivate a faithful following by nurturing conspiracy thinking and conspiracy theories at certain levels. And you can sort of map this into Christianity in certain selective ways. And that's likely behind, some of the pastoral concern that you shared of the individual who is appreciating, I have the same thing with my channel, appreciating your work that they're digesting, but for them, getting anywhere near a church just becomes so triggering in terms of what became for them deep channels in their life about, when I go to church, I see the whole thing as a conspiracy, because this particular parish or this particular congregation or this particular denomination, their entire business model was this. Right. And this, I think, I fear in our age for the right and the left has become so endemic that, in Protestantism right now, churches, is this a blue church or is this a red church?
Right.
And they just quickly fall into this same type of thinking.
Right. And I really resonate with what you said. Like, it's easy to gather a following with conspiracy theory thinking. So it takes different forms in Protestantism and Catholicism. In Protestantism, you can start a new congregation, right? You just start your thing, right? In Catholicism, these people rise up who become sort of spiritual leaders they might try to found a religious order, but they need approval. So often these religious orders will start and then they'll falter because the official approval won't let them go. Sometimes that gets taken and it dies, but sometimes then they go rogue. And that's like the best Catholic conspiracy theories are the sort of would-be founders of religious communities or congregations that get shut down by the authorities and then go rogue. And then it's a perfect storm, because of course they would be shut down by the authorities. Right? And
that would never be approved of because of the conspiracy.
Right? It's built right in. It's built right in. Often, really unfortunately, it's often around like a lot of end time stuff. A lot of, but for us, it's not large. It's not like what the Book of Revelation said. It's what this saint said or what Mary said in this appearance. There was this chastisement or this whatever, right? That's what Catholic end times conspiracy theories look like, you know. So it has its own flavor, but the psychology and even the social dynamics, I would say, are very similar, right? Because I loved what you said about it's easy to build a following.
Yeah.
You can find that and appeal to it.
Yes.
And now online, it's even easier.
Yeah. Well, and then you generate all of the, you know, the loyalty, the tribal, we chosen few who know the truth, and you find your reason for being in a very reactive, negative against. We are fine, and then you draw your reason for being from. I mean, if you're a rogue Catholic group, you draw your reason for being from the existence of the Catholic Church. You know, and we're about to have this in the United States in either 2020 or 2024, when Donald Trump is no longer president. There's a whole group of people for whom, well, gosh, I hope Donald Trump Jr. starts running for office, because then we'll have someone to hate.
Well, and one other thing I should mention about the drawing a crowd, right? It's easy to draw a crowd. The financial implications should not be overlooked. And one of the things that we've seen happen now, and this is interesting, it's not been with not so much founders of religious congregations, but internet sort of media outlets and talking heads.
Oh, yes.
Who have made it a business to keep people in a state of constant anxiety.
Yes.
And so everything that happens, whether it was the Amazon Synod or COVID and the closing of the churches, and now we're seeing it's the reopening of the churches. The same people who are condemning us for closing the churches, now as we reopen, that's an opportunity for the same thing. And what you do is you keep the people in a state of constant anxiety. And if they're in a state of constant anxiety, then they're constantly checking in on you, who is the one person who will tell the truth, and you're liking and sharing and commenting, which is generating advertising revenue. And so you are making money off of keeping people in a state of constant anxiety, which I consider to be basically a form of spiritual abuse.
Yes.
And we learn now that one of the talking heads in Catholic land, a fellow named Taylor Marshall, who broke a story that got him who knows how much hits, advertising dollars, whatever, months after he broke the story, he came out proudly saying that he financed the event. But he pitched it as a hero, right? The event was so groundbreaking and good and whatever, that not only was he a hero for breaking the story, he's also a hero for financing it. Well, hold on a second. Like how much? And he's got people who think he's the only one who's going to tell them the truth.
Yeah.
And they're on the line. And whether they ever send him money personally, he makes money on YouTube for all the hits and the comments and, you know.
Yep.
It's a racket.
And this, I think, to translate it into some Bible language, you'd call this a false prophet.
Yeah.
And it's almost exactly what it is.
Almost by definition.
By definition.
Yeah.
He's a warning person. He's warning. Well, he's just now created a whole environment about warning.
Right.
And now you're exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, I hope this has been worthwhile for you, Brett.
This was fun. Yeah. These ideas, I'm exploring them now and looking for different ways to articulate them. And interacting with you is great. Like, one of the things I hadn't articulated as well that I really appreciated that we got to is how this basic pattern shows up in all kinds of other things. I wouldn't have connected it with the story that intersectionality tells, or the story that the new atheist tells about the beginnings of modern science or whatever. But there's something in the background about agency and authority that makes this kind of storytelling compelling.
Yes.
For human people who are seeking meaning.
Yes.
And Christianity tells us we should be good at sifting through that.
Yes.
Right? And so let's get good at that, both intellectually. Let's recognize the pattern intellectually, but also pastorally. How do we approach the person who is suffering under this, right?
Well, and let's also create communities, because the intellectual and the pastoral, they get instantiated in communities where these habits, and Catholic orders have done this, where these habits, someone comes in with a conspiracy theory, and you don't have to. I have a problem because I'm from New Jersey and I'm Frisian, and so the mocking comes easy, and that really isn't. That really isn't loving, and it's so something in terms of my growing edge and my spiritual maturity, something I have to grow in. But to also have communities where that actually don't encourage the reciprocal narrowing or parasitically feed off of it for money. I think in terms of final judgment, that's not a place you want to be.
Right.
But instead, understand people are given to this. Just like with many of our other weaknesses, these are common to us all. So let's gently figure out ways to, okay, they're gonna post on Facebook for a while. Let's use time the other way too, and say, all right, after it was almost nobody is believing that it's the 5G cell towers that are causing this, maybe we can come around and just gently begin to say, remember when we were thinking these kinds of things? Why did we go down that road?
Right. And it's important to be good winners.
Yeah.
Because nothing creates resentment and fertile soil for conspiracy theories and other problems like feeling like you just lost again. Yeah. That's just going to sow your own destruction,
Very much so. Well, Brett, this has been just, I knew it would be, and we'll talk again, because I said right when I started talking to you, I thought, oh, this is a guy that we can have some fun conversations together. And I deeply enjoy every time we speak.
Awesome. So. Well, hey, look, if you put conspiracy theory in the title, it should get some hits on YouTube, right?
Well, I always get about the same amount of hits. Mostly it doesn't vary greatly, but
no?
it's to me in many ways the value is in the conversation, and we'll just see whatever God does with it. That's cool with me.
Yeah, it's way more hits than I ever get. Anyway, so who am I to say?
Well, that's just a weird. That's just my strange life. So.
Oh, happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, take care, Brett. We'll talk again.
Good to chat, Paul.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.